Men need to be held accountable when they make a mistake. And I want to make sure that each of us, no matter what party you represent, is able to go to your home district and say, I did what was right for you today. I did what was right for you, your children, your grandchildren. I did what was right for America. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. What purpose, gentleman?
Mr. Chairman, before yielding to Mr. Lynch, I just want to say one thing. You know, I listened to the gentleman, and I have the utmost respect for him. But I remind him that this is American jurisprudence that has had the concept of innocent until proven guilty for as long as he just talked about.
Will the gentleman yield?
You know, I just want to finish this. I listened to you very carefully. You had an outstanding speech, but I want to just make sure we're clear on something. The senior executives suspected right now of criminal activity may already be removed or replaced for an indefinite suspension without pay. And so, you know, we need to focus on improving agency implementation. You talked about the Neely case, rather than passing legislation that would deprive employees of their due process rights. And I want to keep in mind that there is a little thing called the Constitution of the United States of America that every 2 years we come and we swear we're going to uphold. And part of that Constitution is about due process. And that's what we are trying to adhere to here. And I think we have to be very careful when we start looking at just individual cases. We're making legislation for federal employees throughout this country. And so I just want to be one of those cautious, just provide some caution there. Right now I want to yield to distinguished gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is
thank
recognized.
the gentleman for yielding. First of all, I want to say that I have the utmost affection and respect for the gentleman from Pennsylvania. He and I are friends. But I must say that he's wrong on this case. And it's ironic that you choose James Madison as the one person that you rely upon in your argument, because it was James Madison that actually drafted the Due Process Clause. He was the one that took the recommendations from the delegates from New York and actually drafted the text. He made his own amendments to the Due Process Clause that we today rely upon to protect constitutional rights. Let me also talk about the senior executive service in our federal government. Those are the employees that rise to the top. They do after years of serving, or in many cases because of their expertise in protecting our veterans at the VA hospitals. But the senior executive service is an experienced core of dedicated federal employees who provide institutional stability and continuity across administrations, and they serve as a vital link between political appointees, frontline managers, and the federal workforce. We don't want each administration coming in and saying, for no reason, well, I'm a Republican, I'm going to fire all the Democratic executives in the senior executive service. We don't want a Democrat coming in and saying, okay, I'm going to fire all these Republicans who are in senior positions. So one of the protections we provide is due process of law. And despite the important role that senior executive service employees play in the federal government, this bill that's on the floor today would deprive these employees of the basic due process rights available to them under existing law. The legislation would give agency heads the broad discretion to just fire people, fire senior executives that are suspected of misconduct, and employees would bear the burden of proving their reinstatement. This is called ready, fire, aim. It would allow firing employees for basically any reason that in the discretion of the senior management is required. And it presumes, as the gentleman from Maryland, and I congratulate him on his advocacy here, it presumes guilt before we get all the facts. And that is completely inconsistent with the principles of our Constitution. I am deeply concerned that this legislation may cause irreparable reputational damage if an individual is wrongly accused and is forced to seek reinstatement. the person may eventually be vindicated, but the damage to the individual's reputation, their financial stability, and their career may be beyond repair. Moreover, there are effective tools already existing to hold senior executives accountable for performance and conduct issues. These disciplinary procedures provide, very simply, 30 days notice. You have to have notice why you're fired in writing. That's not a lot to ask. 30 days notice of why you're being fired. This is what you're eliminating from the law right now. It gives that person 30 days to scramble to get a representative to put a case together to say, no, these aren't the facts. It allows them, if they are able, to get an attorney or a representative, which includes the right to that written decision and the right to appeal to the Merit Systems Protection Board. Those are the basic due process rights that James Madison has supported. You're right, James Madison is still here today. He's on this side. He's on the side of due process. He doesn't want a kangaroo court. He wanted protections for constitutional rights. And he thought it was so important he incorporated those in the text of the Constitution. During committee consideration of H.R. 2579, I offered an amendment to apply these existing due process protections to the expedited removal provisions in the bill, but my amendment was rejected. And for these reasons, and I say again, I have great respect for the gentleman from Pennsylvania. I urge my colleagues to vote against this measure in support of due process, in support of the principles that James Madison advocated. And also I want to say the previous bill that the gentleman talked about earlier, that we voted on, 410 votes, that had the ready, aim, then fire provision. It gave the due process rights. The bill that we supported in the previous session, it wasn't exactly the same, as the gentleman acknowledged. It had due process rights. It allowed employees to have 30 days to have a written decision, to know what the charges were against them, and to respond. So this is a very, very different bill than passed the House overwhelmingly in the previous session. This bill does not allow the employee the 30 days notice of what they did wrong. It does not allow them to defend themselves against the charges. It does not allow them to have a representative. It does not allow them the ability to protect their reputation in real time. This bill fires them first and then asks questions later. And for those reasons, it should be rejected. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How much time do I have remaining?
8 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield as much time as the gentleman from Pennsylvania may consume.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
I thank the gentleman, Mr. Speaker, and my colleagues on the other side. I do have great respect for both of the gentlemen. It's not a question of respect for other members of Congress. The question is, how much respect do we have for American taxpayers? I think sometimes we get too confused right here about the collegial atmosphere that has to exist. You know, if you don't talk nicely to each other, it could cause a problem, and I understand that. But we know each other. I've shared some very emotional moments with Mr. Cummings when he lost his nephew. I understand that. And Steve and I, Mr. Lynch and I know each other. Listen, it's not about the spin. Nobody is losing their due process under this. You know that. You know that. No, not yet, Steve. Not yet, not yet, not yet. And I go, again, refer back to page 8, lines 15 through 17. An employee against whom an action is taken under this section is entitled to appeal to the Merit Systems Protection Board under Section 7701 of this title.
Will the
We're
gentleman
not
yield?
stripping, not yet, sir, please.
Gentleman is not yielding.
There's no reason for us to be having a conversation that, again, divides the nation. And it divides people because we constantly want to make sure that everybody understands that one party is for one type of philosophy, the other party is not. You know, they don't want to ever take care of everybody. I'm talking about the American taxpayer here. I'm talking about the agencies.
Gentleman yield,
Please, Mr. Lynch, it's my time.
Okay.
Mr. Cummings and I sat and listened to the people from the GSA, and when we asked them why are they placed on leave with pay when there's an investigation going on, you knew about it, the IG came to you and told you about that. In spite of that, you still bonused this gentleman. They gave him extra money for doing exactly what he was being investigated for. And we said, my goodness, why would you do that? And they said, because we don't have any tools to do anything about it. We don't have the mechanism to do that. Why is it that we have to constantly widen the gap between what's right for America and what's just flat out right? This isn't about Democrats and Republicans trying to protect our friends that work here in the government. Of course I want to protect them. And I will guarantee you that if this is going to pass today, I guarantee you will not see a mass exodus of people that work for the government saying, oh my gosh, let me get my resume together, I got to get out of here. They're not leaving. Then why aren't they leaving? Because these are good jobs. We're talking about the senior executives. We're not talking about every gal and guy. We're not talking about those in uniform who protect us. We're talking about the senior executives, those to whom we have given the most responsibility and authority. We're talking about giving them a tool to hold those who work under them responsible. They don't have it now. I don't want to walk away or turn my back on people who work every day for this government. These are darn good jobs. Please tell me, if it's such a terrible place to work in,
will the gentleman
why
yield?
do
I will
so many
tell him.
people apply for
Will
work?
the gentleman yield?
No, I will not.
Well, you asked me to
listen,
tell you.
Mr. Lynch, we've been yielding far too long it doesn't make sense to me. I'll be glad to yield you when I'm done here, and that's up to the chairman. But I got to tell you, why do we constantly put this spin on this to divide this body? If I were a manager and I were put in charge and given the responsibility to do things, but then told, look, you have the responsibility, you better perform to the right level here. But by the way, when you have people who are not acting appropriately, you don't have any tool to change that. You don't have any way to reprimand them. You don't have any way to call them forward. It just doesn't make sense. And I'll tell you who it doesn't make sense to. It doesn't make sense to all those folks I described about before. I've got people back in western Pennsylvania working 2 jobs. This is Dad and Mom working a job. Why? Because they have this tremendous ability, this self-reliance, and they know they've got children they've got to take care of. They want to feed them, they want to clothe them, they want to educate them. They want to be part of a system that has made sense to so many people for so long. Why do people come to this country? My goodness, they come across the ocean in inner tubes to try and get here. They crawl across the desert to get here. They don't get here because they don't like us. They get here because they love the opportunity. All I want to do is give the managers of these agencies the same tools that everybody else has. This is not about trying to make an employee look bad. This is about holding an employee accountable. When is it that we got to the point that accountability is a political agenda? Really? Really? And we're going to take any time we can get to try and make the other party look bad. Because I've watched here for 2.5 years, it's not enough to win the vote. You've got to make the other side look really, really bad. It's not enough to say we just didn't agree on this and we moved to something else. No, the point is to say, you know what, this is how horrible these people are. They don't care about you. They don't care about your kids, your grandchildren. They don't care about anything. They really want to hurt you. Now we've shared too much time together. I don't sit in any committee with anybody, whether from our party or from your party, that says, I came here to destroy America. They don't say that. They don't say, I came here to divide America. They don't say that. They say, I came here because I thought I had a calling and I want to make a difference. This bill is so simple. It's so much common sense. Really? This is a problem to hold people accountable for a job they're not doing right? We didn't strip them anything in due process. They still have their rights to everything. And it's for everybody, it's for the senior executives at the top. That's all it's about. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back to you. But I got to tell you, this is so common sense. It's what we do in the private sector every day. I don't want it to become a political battle over something that makes sense for the American people. I thank you, and I yield back.
Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman from North Carolina reserves.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 3 minutes to... First of all, how much time do we have, Mr. Chairman?
You have 8 minutes. Members are reminded by the chair to address their remarks to the chair.
I yield 3 minutes to the distinguished lady from the District of Columbia.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I thank the gentleman from Maryland for yielding. You know, it has been sad to have to sit here for so long and hear the Kafkaesque understanding of due process by the gentleman from Pennsylvania. In a word, due process has to come before the sanction, not after, before the loss of jobs, not after, or it means nothing. Today, of course, I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 2579 that would eliminate due process protections for senior executive service members by allowing agency heads, political appointees, for the first time since the passage of the great civil service reforms in the early part of the 20th century, to fire SES employees without giving them advance notice or an opportunity to address allegations against them before they were dismissed. This bill in particular gives real credence to those who see the series of bills on the floor today as an attack on federal employees. H.R. 2579 would reverse the long-settled principle of innocent until proven guilty to guilty until proven innocence. Employees could be immediately fired by the appointed agency head. They could get their job back only by accepting the burden of proof to prove their innocence. It's not enough that employees would be notified of the reasons for their removal and would have 30 days to respond. They're gone. They're still fired immediately. No due process rights like those currently in place. At least 30 days notice, representation by an attorney, a written decision, a right to appeal to the Merit Systems Protection Board. The absence of due process and of standards that the political appointee must use for the decision to fire is nothing short of breathtaking. Under this bill, the agency head, one person, one political appointee, determines whether the employee knowingly acted in a manner that, get this, endangers the interest of the agency mission. What could be broader than that? Anything. Anything. You could be fired for anything under that standard. One person decides whether the employee's removal is, quote, necessary in the interest of the United States. Wow. Let's rein that in somewhat. One person decides that other procedures prescribed in other provisions, and this is no lawyer, this is no judge, but they're saying other procedures just can't be invoked, they're not good enough. There you have it. Judge and jury. Exactly what the civil service system was developed to avoid, exactly what the Constitution says we must avoid. If you believe in the Constitution, it is important not to demagogue, but rather to explain to the public why every state, local, and federal government puts employees.
I yield to Gentlelady 2 more minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Why it is that every unit of government puts employees they want to fire, they know they want to fire them, on administrative leave without pay, while due process proceeds even when the person is accused of serious offenses. Because the employer, my friends, is the government. That's the difference. The employee has certain due process rights that employee would not have if the employer were a private business. That is Civics 101, gentlemen. Justice Powell, writing in Arnett versus Kennedy about due process rights for federal employees, said that due process, quote, is conferred not by legislative grace, but by constitutional guarantee. This bill comes from a Republican House that requires that members state the constitutional basis for every bill introduced in this House. This bill expresses a Republican frustration that Lois Lerner of the IRS was placed on administrative leave with pay. Sorry, folks, you're not allowed to support the Constitution only when you like the results. Let's defeat this prove your innocence departure from the Constitution of the United States. And I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to say, first of all, I want to associate myself with the words of the gentlelady from the District of Columbia. I think she said it quite well. Mr. Speaker, we must be about the business of guarding this thing we call the Constitution. We are here only for a moment. Only for a moment. And in that moment, we have already been given a document by which we should govern ourselves by. It has been interpreted by courts over and over again. And one of the things that has stood the test of time is due process. That very due process, I've said many a times, has allowed me to be a member of this Congress of the United States and so many others that would have never had an opportunity. And so no matter when we are here, no matter what time we are here for, we must guard it. Mr. Lynch was very clear when he talked about how we are in a situation where we fire somebody first, and then suddenly we say, okay, we're going to give them some due process. Going back to Ms. Norton, due process becomes before the firing. That's the way it's supposed to be. And we all care about every employee. We care about how every American is treated. And that's what this argument is all about, fairness. And with that, I'll reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I continue to reserve.
Gentleman continues to reserve. Gentleman from Maryland.
How much time do we have, Mr. Speaker?
2 minutes.
I yield to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, 1 minute and 15 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman, and I appreciate his advocacy. I do want to point out some inconsistencies in the argument by my friend from Pennsylvania. In the case of Mr. Nealon and in the case of Lois Lerner, under existing law, all that was required before they fired either of those individuals is to give them 30 days notice. 30 days written notice of the charges against them. Give them the 30 days to put together a defense or to offer their version of the facts. That's all that was required. And then we could have fired them or put them on administrative leave without pay. That was within the discretion of GSA. So when GSA tells Mr. Kelly they can't do anything, there's plenty they could do. They could have taken both those employees, put them on administrative leave without pay. Talk about protecting the taxpayer. I'm for that. They had the power to do that in these cases. They could have taken both those employees under current law with due process in place, put them both on administrative leave without pay, and we could have protected the taxpayer. That was a discretion on the part of the administration and the folks that made the decision in that place. It was not a fault of the law. But interestingly enough, it also protected us to have the second version of the facts put forward to bring more light to the...
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to allow Mr. Lynch to close in the 45 seconds we have left.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. Think about this. That due process right would allow an employee who might be the fall guy, it might be a person that they're trying to fire to shut them up. It gives them an opportunity to come before the public and say, while they're still in their job, to say, no, that's not the way it went down. It gives that individual employee. Now, it might be to the benefit of the Republican. It might be the benefit of the Democrat, whatever whatever position you have, whoever that individual might be. But it brings truth. It brings facts. And it brings the ability of that individual employee to protect themselves. That's what we're asking for here. That 30 days opportunity. And it can be without pay. We can protect the taxpayer and still give due process rights to our employees. This bill should be opposed for all those reasons. I thank the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, for yielding, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Facts are a stubborn thing, and what we are hearing today are a number of assertions that truly are not the facts. Let me read from the bill, because the opposing arguments would be that we can fire them for any particular reason. But that's not what the bill says. The bill says we may remove an employee for serious neglect of duty, misappropriation of funds, which I might add was the case in point with where we were just talking about, or malfeasance. And the head of the agency has to know that it was knowingly done. This gives just another tool in the toolbox. It doesn't do away with due process. It doesn't do away with a number of the facts that we already have today, but it adds another tool. What it really does is allow our managers to manage. What a novel concept. We're going to actually allow and trust federal employees to manage the people under them. We have been in hearing after hearing that says, well, why didn't you do something about it? Why did you not address this? And they said, well, our hands are tied. We didn't have the tools to do it. This bill, as Mr. Kelly has so eloquently put it, gives them the tool to do exactly that. It doesn't do away with due process. We've accepted amendments, 3 different amendments that protect the rights of employees. They are embedded in this bill, and yet we still find that my colleagues opposite want to say that they're not in support of this. I just find it just appalling that we can continue to allow employees to stay on the taxpayers' dollars when we know that there has been malfeasance, misappropriation of funds, and the neglect of duty. With that, I encourage all my colleagues to support this particular piece of legislation, and I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2579 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules...
Yeas and nays.
Does the gentleman ask for the yeas and nays?
Yes.
The yeas and nays are requested. Yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. Sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20. Further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina rise?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1541 as amended.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1541, a bill to establish limitations during any sequestration period on the total amount in awards or other discretionary monetary payments which may be paid to any federal employee.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows, and the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, will each control 20 minutes. Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My bill, H.R. 1541, brings common sense to the policies governing federal employee bonuses while still providing agency flexibility to recognize outstanding performance. In fiscal year 2011, 75% of senior executive service employees throughout the federal government received bonuses at an average of nearly $11,000 per person. The government's decision to furlough hundreds of regular, often blue-collar federal workers while senior employees cash in is unacceptable. Americans are rapidly losing trust in government as the list of abuses by federal agencies grow. But bureaucrats continue collecting large bonuses at the expense of hard-working taxpayers. The IRS is a prime example. Between the years of 2006 to 2012, IRS Director of Exempt Organizations Lois Lerner was paid a combined total of $110,035 in bonuses. Ferris Fink, the senior IRS official best known for his starring role as Mr. Spock in Star Trek parody at the IRS conference, received some $149,506 in bonuses between 2007 and 2012. The Federal Aviation Authority is another example. It threatened 90-minute delays for airline passengers in the weeks leading up to sequestration. However, the FAA handed out more than $12 million in bonuses during fiscal year 2012, despite knowing that sequestration was likely to occur. These bonuses exemplify Washington's spending problem. A national debt of $17 trillion and an unemployment at 7.5% should not add up to millions of dollars in bonus payouts. Following the President's decision to impose a 2-year pay freeze at the end of 2010, the administration issued a memo limiting the amount of available pay bonuses for fiscal years 2011 and 2012. This past February, the administration issued a memo limiting bonuses to those legally required. And in June, the administration suspended rank awards for senior leaders. This bill builds on the administration's initiatives limiting the amount and number of bonuses paid to federal workers in periods of sequestration. It is time for the government to stop furloughing workers who depend on paychecks from week to week while awarding hundreds of thousands of dollars in bonuses to senior employees. I urge all members to support the Common Sense and Compensation Act, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am very disappointed. I yield myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, I am very disappointed that the Republican leadership is wasting the few days we have remaining before the August recess with political message bills like this one instead of dealing with the major challenges the American people want us to address. The American people care about jobs. Let me say that again. The American people care about jobs. And the Democrats have introduced a Make It in America agenda that would create good-paying jobs by rebuilding America's infrastructure, investing in innovation and education, and reducing the deficit through a balanced approach. But the Republican leadership apparently has chosen a no-jobs agenda. It has been 7 months since the start of this Congress, and we have not passed a single jobs bill on the floor of this House. Instead, the Republican sequestration plan is expected to cost up to 1.6 million American jobs through next year. The American people also want the Congress to pass a budget for our country. More than 4 months ago, both the Senate and the House passed their respective budgets, but the House Republicans are now refusing to appoint conferees to complete negotiations. For years, Republicans complained about not having a budget, yet now they are actively blocking it by refusing to negotiate with the Senate. Rather than dealing with these critical issues, we're being asked to vote on H.R. 1541, which is one of many bills that are a part of a relentless campaign to demonize federal employees. H.R. 1541 would impose arbitrary, across-the-board cap of 5% of basic pay on the amount of bonuses that federal workers can receive and limit the number of senior executives who may receive performance awards to 33% of those eligible in each agency. These employees carry out our critical missions that serve and protect the American people. Among these awards are Presidential Rank Awards for senior executives who saved the federal government more than $95 million last year. Quality step increases for our highest federal employee performance. Awards to law enforcement officers for foreign language capabilities, and recruitment, retention, and relocation incentives to fill critical gaps in such fields as nursing, information technology, and cybersecurity. I'm very concerned about the federal government's recruitment and retention efforts if Congress eliminates agency discretion to provide awards to our best performers. In an analysis of the, quote, best places to work in the federal government, the Partnership for Public Service and Deloitte found that only 4 out of 10 federal workers believe they will be rewarded or promoted for doing a good job. This is the definition of counterproductive. I don't understand how Republicans can call for pay performance and then eliminate the very performance awards they said they supported. Last Congress, our committee chairman, Representative Issa, and committee member Dennis Ross sent a letter to the Government Accountability Office proposing that we replace the federal government's general schedule system with a, quote, merit-based, market-sensitive system that recognizes and rewards individual employee performance, end of quote. How can we take such proposals seriously if we're being asked at the same time to slash the very awards that are supposed to incentivize performance? Of course, we cannot. For these reasons, I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing H.R. 2579, and I ask unanimous consent for Congressman Lynch to manage the remainder of our time, and with that, I yield back.
Without objection.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves his time. Without objection, the gentleman from Massachusetts will control the remaining time. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 3 minutes to my distinguished colleague from the state of Michigan, Mr. Bentivolio.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman from North Carolina for yielding. Mr. Speaker, common sense is something often discussed here, but it is rarely put into practice. It's time for that to change. That's why we need the Common Sense and Compensation Act. While the administration plays political games with the sequestration by forcing hardworking Americans to take a furlough, they continue to hand out bonus checks to highly paid bureaucrats. Between 2008 and 2011, the federal government spent $340 million. That's $340 million on cash bonuses for senior executives, senior employees. Some of these bureaucrats have used their time to attack the average American through regulations and tax code. The American people are not getting what they paid for from many of these federal regulators and senior staff. The Common Sense and Compensation Act brings much-needed reform to the bonus system for federal employees. Under this legislation, employee discretionary bonuses are limited to no more than 5% of their base salary, while the sequestration is in effect. Additionally, it limits the total amount of senior executive service performance awards to 33% of all SES employees in a given agency. Both of these changes prevents the most wealthy in the federal system from becoming richer, while those actually engaging and serving the general public are getting laid off. Opponents of the bill may claim that limiting federal government employee bonuses may be an unsound business move. Here's what I think. It is an unsound business move, being $17 trillion in debt and shackling our grandchildren with a nation worse off than how we received it from our parents. When a business is struggling, they don't pass out bonuses, they cut waste. It's time to rein in spending, and this practice of excessive bonuses for the very top of our bureaucracy must stop, while we're all trying to tighten our belts. If we truly want to rein in our spending, we need to fix not just the amount of time we choose to spend, amount of money we choose to spend, but how effectively we spend it as well. Making sure that those who provide the actual services to the public aren't being furloughed at the expense of luxurious bonuses for upper management is a good way to start. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Chairman, I just yield myself such time as I may consume. The tailored use of incentive awards such as performance-based bonuses helps agencies recruit, develop, and retain employees who have the knowledge, skill, and ability to help agencies accomplish their critical missions. Such incentives also allow agencies to compete with the private sector for talent. Right now we have incredible doctors at the VA hospitals all across America, incredible nurses also, and therapists and staff at our VA hospitals that I'm sure, at least in my district, they could walk out that door and earn sometimes twice or three times as much at a private hospital as they do at the VA. And the incentive programs that we have in place allow us to rebalance a little bit of what they might be compensated, but for the fact that they are committed to caring for our veterans. It's a similar situation with the SEC. Obviously, many of our securities analysts that we use at the SEC could go to Wall Street tomorrow and earn multiples of what their salary is and have great success and incredible rewards financially. But they work at the SEC because they're committed to protecting the taxpayer and working on behalf of their country. We have similar examples of banking supervisors at the FDIC that have such knowledge and such capability that they could go out tomorrow for one of these big banks, Citibank or Bank of America, and go to work tomorrow at multiples of their salary. We have derivative analysts over at the CFTC that do such great work on our behalf that I'm sure, because that's such a hot area of employment, and with their expertise and their resumes could demand tremendous resources. As well, we have scientists at NIH and lawyers over at the Department of Justice that we're lucky to have working on behalf of the government because we're trying to keep up with the changes in industry and in these areas of commerce that require excellent talent. For example, a 2010 RAND Corporation study found that the Department of Defense increased use of bonuses had positive effects on recruitment and retention in the armed forces. Notably, the study found that without the increase in bonuses, Army enlistments would have been 20% lower between 2004 and 2008 when the war in Iraq was at its peak. Further, the study found that bonuses were generally a cost-effective measure. Despite the importance of performance awards, this bill, H.R. 1541 as amended, would prohibit federal workers from receiving discretionary bonuses that exceed 5% of their base pay during sequestration. This is at a time, this bill couldn't happen at a worse time. H.R. 1541 would undermine the federal government's ability to recruit and retain its most talented employees in the midst of a 3-year federal pay freeze and ongoing furloughs. Right now, we have over 700,000 federal employees at DOD that have taken 11-day furloughs. I sat with a group of firefighters on an Air Force base that are concerned about the safety protocols at that base because of the number of employees that are affected by furloughs. We've got 90,000 employees in other agencies that are taking between 2- and 5-day furloughs, and those furloughs are going to continue. H.R. 1541 would undermine the federal government's ability to recruit and retain our most talented employees in the midst of all these cutbacks. This bill would simply continue to demoralize the federal workforce. By removing agency flexibility, the legislation would also impede managers in their efforts to keep employees committed and motivated to excel and to provide superior service. It is understandable that these employees do accept less pay because they work for the government in many of these industries that I mentioned. Further, these awards are exactly the type of individual merit-based performance management tools that the committee chairman and other committee members have embraced in the past. During committee consideration, I offered an amendment that would exempt collective bargaining agreements from the caps on awards, but the majority modified my amendment so the caps would still apply to future agreements. I believe that determining by law or statute the terms of future bargaining agreements with the recognized representatives of those employees improperly interferes with the management and labor contract negotiations. This legislation would restrict agency flexibility at a time when it is critically needed for ensuring that the federal workforce attracts and retains the best and brightest. For these reasons, I ask my colleagues to join me in opposing H.R. 1541, and I reserve.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield to the gentleman from Tennessee 3 minutes to my distinguished colleague from Tennessee.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise in strong support of H.R. 1541, the Common Sense and Compensation Act. I thank the gentleman from North Carolina for yielding me this time, and I also want to commend him for coming up with this very sensible, reasonable, moderate response in legislation to a problem that's been growing bigger and bigger with each passing year. As one previous speaker, the gentleman from Michigan, mentioned, in one recent 3-year period there were over $340 million worth of federal bonuses given out. I didn't know about that figure, but I've seen some other figures which relate to this this legislation that I would like to mention at this time. A couple of years ago, the Commerce Department's Bureau of Economic Analysis completed a study showing that the average federal employee received a salary and benefits totaling $119,982, while the average private sector employee made a salary and benefits of $59,909. In other words, the federal salaries and benefits were approximately twice or double what people in the private sector were receiving. The Washington Examiner newspaper, in a lead editorial after that report came out, described these federal salaries as, quote, scandalously higher than private salaries, and added, quote, with the federal deficit and national debt heading into the stratosphere, taxpayers can no longer afford to support such lucrative government compensation. And certainly it's already been mentioned that our national debt is now approximately $17 trillion, a figure that almost no human being can really comprehend. At the height of the recession, there was a front page story in USA Today which said, quote, that quote, federal workers are enjoying an extraordinary boom time in pay and timing during a recession that has cost 7.3 million jobs in the private sector, unquote. And the report in USA Today said that, quote, the highest paid federal employees are doing best of all. I saw a report, read a report a few months ago that said of the six of the 10 wealthiest counties in this country were all suburban counties to Washington, D.C. In addition to much higher federal salaries and benefits, federal employees have the best pension plans in this country, while fewer than 20% of employees in the private sector even have any employer-provided pension plan other than Social Security. These very high pensions were started many years ago when federal salaries often were lower than in the private sector. But that is certainly not the case today when federal salaries are averaging about twice what the average salary is in the private sector. Also, federal employees are allowed to retire at younger ages. Almost everyone, Mr. Speaker, I realize feels underpaid when you hear about these obscene, ridiculous salaries of CEOs and athletes and movie stars. But federal employees need to realize that you're talking about just 1/10 of 1% of the people there, and compared to about 96 or 97% of the American people, federal employees are very fortunate to have their jobs and are very well paid. And I know from my experience with the Tennessee Valley Authority, where where they've given out bonuses, many bonuses in the hundreds of thousands of dollar range, that this situation will spiral completely out of control because big government can justify or rationalize almost anything.
I'll yield one more minute.
Gentleman's yielded one more minute.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I don't really need that much time, but I will simply say that this is a good bill. This is good legislation to limit these bonuses to about 5% of these very high salaries, and I hope all of my colleagues will support H.R. 1541, the Common Sense in Compensation Act, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance. Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you. Could I ask the Speaker, the Chairman, how much time we have left on our side?
Gentleman has 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to yield myself such time as I may consume. I just want to address a couple of the issues that the gentleman has raised, and I have enormous respect for the previous speaker as well. Oftentimes, these studies that you look at the average employee in the federal government versus the average employee in the private sector. In recent decades, the federal government has privatized a lot of our common labor rather than employing them directly. And we have become a much more specialized and much more professionalized workforce between the doctors who we hire, the nurses that we hire at the VA, the scientists that we have at the National Institution of Health and the EPA, the lawyers we have at the Department of Justice, financial analysts that we have at the CFTC and FDIC, as well as the other banking industries, the SEC. Those are more professionalized employees. So naturally, if you look at a retail clerk, compare their salary to a scientist, there'll be a drastic disparity between what an attorney is making or a financial analyst is making versus a secretary in the private sector. So that's a very crude way of comparison. One way of comparison is required in the Federal Pay Comparability Act. That's a statute that we passed here in Congress. And it requires that we compare the levels of federal doctors versus private sector doctors, federally employed scientists versus private sector scientists, finance analysts at the SEC versus those at Goldman Sachs. So we compare job to job. And at the end of that analysis, the study showed that federal employees are making 26% less than their comparable job in the private sector. Just a point I wanted to raise, and I continue to reserve. Thank you.
Continues to reserve. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I wanted to address a few of the items that have been brought up because, we seem to talk about these in abstract ways, but the truth of the matter is that bonuses have gotten way out of hand. When we start to give out bonuses as ways to bypass the payment structure that we have established for the federal government employees, that was not what it was intended to do. The ranking member earlier, Mr. Speaker, it mentioned a survey, which was the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey. And he mentioned in there, he used that data as evidence of really about performance pay. But I'd like to quote from that same study, that same survey. A recent survey found that only 22% of federal employees believe that performance and pay are linked. And I'd like to point out that this bill certainly would cover that. We are not saying do away with all bonuses. Quite the contrary. We believe that people need to be incentivized. We believe in merit pay. We believe in bonuses for those that work. But I can say this, that when you start paying out bonuses to 75% of all senior executive employees, the people back home don't understand. Maybe the people in Massachusetts understand, but I can tell you the people in North Carolina don't understand. We've got some 7,000 senior executive service employees that make an average of $168,500 every year. So when you go back home and you say, well, they're making $168,000 a year, and on top of that, we're going to pay them a $30,000 bonus, those people don't understand. Whether they work for the federal government or whether they are in the private sector, they don't understand. I've got single moms, Mr. Speaker, that said, you know what, I'd be glad to go to work just for the bonus pay that you're paying some of those federal workers. So, you know, we go on a lot and we start talking about it, but, you know, it's interesting because many times my colleagues on the opposite side of the aisle want to go ahead and talk about what is fair. Well, this is not fair, Mr. Speaker. When we start to look at that, the rich indeed are getting richer at the expense of the hardworking American taxpayers, and that is not what we should be doing. I also want to go on a little bit further, because when we start to look at these bonuses, it is the federal employees in my district that have a problem with it as well. I have two of them, Paula and Martha. And I won't give their last names, but Paula and Martha, I was there talking to them, and they said, you know, we are sacrificing under this pay freeze. We're having to give up. Why in the world are you awarding such bonuses to these people when we're having to suffer? Now, I know the gentleman from Massachusetts has a real heart for federal employees, as do I. I look here, and there are a number of people that I would call my friends. There are a number of people that are watching this, perhaps even on TV right now, that are federal employees that I enjoy being with. This is not about them. This is about being fair. And what it is when we start to pick the winners and losers with bonuses and bypass the payment structure that we have, you know, it's not right, Mr. Speaker. And we have to adjust that, and I would be glad to work in a bipartisan way. If we're having a hard time retaining scientists and doctors, I'll be glad to work in a bipartisan way with my friend opposite here to come up with a structure that works on pay and merit pay to that and address it. But why do we allow the bonuses that we have today to bypass the very fundamental reason that we have it set up? And with that, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you. I appreciate the gentleman's comments. I do want to point out, though, if we're talking about what's fair or what's not fair, I think the federal employees have taken it on the chin recently. They're in the third year, year 3 of their pay freeze. A lot of them say that's not fair because as costs keep going up, their pay has been frozen for the past 3 years. And now, on top of the third-year pay freeze, they're being asked, at least 700,000 employees in the Department of Defense, including civilian employees that we rely on for a lot of key services, being asked to take 11 days on furlough without pay. About 100,000 other federal employees are being asked to take between 2 and 5 days right now. And that's just the first year of sequestration. I think we cut $37 billion. This year we'll cut $52 billion. Next year is $60, and this is just year 2 in a 10-year furlough schedule. So, if you want to talk about unfair, I think that they're being asked to do more than their share. I do want to remind the gentleman that the bonuses and awards limited by this bill, H.R. 1541, are based on performance. The quality step increases are given to rank-and-file employees who achieve superior performance. The Presidential Rank Awards are given to senior employees who achieve extraordinary results or who are able to sustain superior accomplishments. Recruitment bonuses, now they can't be paid to employees who work for the federal government, but someone who's done a very good job in the private sector, running a hospital might come onto the federal payroll to do that, and we might have to recognize that person's prior service. An individual's performance rating is based on how well they met or exceeded their expectations. In addition, I know that my friends across the aisle are eager to cap federal employee and senior executives' pay, but they're completely silent on capping federal contractor pay. Under current law, federal contract executives can be reimbursed by the federal government for their salaries up to $950,000. Federal contractors. This is the private side. These are not the folks that are being capped. These are not employees. These are private contractors. $950,000 for 2013. Not a word in print or speech to cap those individuals. Contracting employees of the Department of Defense, Coast Guard, and NASA can also have their salaries reimbursed up to $950,000 as well in this current year, 2013. The maximum salary, just a comparison, the maximum salary for a senior executive in the federal government is $179,700. $179,700. For example, the federal, the VA administration head, the hospital director at one of my hospitals, he makes $179,700. $179,000. While the average salary in my district for a hospital director in the private sector is $800,000. That's for the private hospitals in my area. So my VA director earns about 25% of what they make in the private sector. And by the way, the maximum salary for a general schedule step 10 employee at the top of the ladder is $155,500. That's what we're talking about here. And they are blown away by the salaries paid, as I mentioned, $950,000 in 2013 for federal contract executives who are not federal employees but are on the federal payroll, about which this bill says zero, completely silent. Zip. Okay, I yield back. I reserve, continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from North Carolina.